In 1954, the United States started the largest deportation operation in its history. The operation saw over 1.1 million people deported back to Central America. Like many things in the latter half of the 20th century, this all begins in the Second World War, with Hitler's onslaught across Europe and the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor 2 years later.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
With America now in the war, millions of young men were now needed to go fight in the front. This made it so that every industry had a large shortage of workers. In the manufacturing sector, women would take up most of the vacancies seen. In the agricultural sector, however, the Americans would come to the Mexicans and start the Farm Labor Agreement Act of 1940, more commonly known as the Bracero Program.
Why braceros? The question is so widespread that we consider it a public service to tell the why and how of braceros on American farms. Many field crops still call for stoop labor. Here is stoop labor in the literal meaning of the term. But the term is also applied to many of the toughest and least desirable farm jobs. For example, no stooping here, yet because citrus trees are thorny, more difficult to pick than other fruits, most farm workers avoid this kind of job. All such farm jobs which are tough, dirty, or unpleasant are generally referred to as stoop labor. Understandably, then, this is the only area in which the American farm labor supply falls short and is supplemented by Mexican citizens, sometimes called nationals or Mexican nationals. But the term most commonly used is braceros. In Spanish, this means a man who works with his arms and hands.
The American government would have around 5 million Mexican citizens enter the United States throughout 1942 to 1964.
This is Salvador Ballesteros, 40 years old, a bracero. At home in northern Mexico, he earns about $200 a year farming 2 acres of cotton owned by someone else. $200 to support a wife and 6 children. Even in Mexico, this is not much. It is Salvador's dream for himself and for his children to own a piece of land. To buy land, he must earn more money doing the only thing he knows how to do, farming. And the only way he can do this is to work in the United States as a bracero.
In the 1940s, Mexico, like most of the periphery, was extremely underdeveloped. When word came down of a program in the United States that paid far more than anything near the rural farmers, they took the chance to leave everything they had behind. Many went on foot, others took trains, some standing in boxcars for days on end.
Todas mojadas, las mojaron con mangueras, como que las lavaron, como que traían ahí ganado y luego las lavaron y así mojados no nos podíamos sentar, no podíamos sentarnos, que íbamos parados todos así, alrededor del carro, del vagón del tren, así parados. Así. Cuando ya agarramos los furgones hay que comprar los periódicos y en un periódico va para abajo, en la puerta salir.
When they reached the United States, they'll find thousands just like them, all trying to have a chance at living without the heavy burden of poverty. Before allowed entry to the United States, the men underwent their first health inspection. Not only was their health considered though, but also their appearance. If a person did not look strong enough, they were turned away. If they looked too wealthy, they were also blocked. They also checked everyone's hands. If your hands did not have calluses and the skin was too soft, you would be turned away. Once in the United States, they would be bussed over to their own processing facility, where they underwent a second inspection.
At the border, individuality disappears in a cloud of DDT dust. For perhaps the first time in his life, he gets a thorough physical examination, partly for his protection, and partly to make sure his American employer will get his money's worth.
Once their inspection was done, they were bussed over to their labor camp. It is here where they would spend almost every waking moment of their lives. The labor camps would have various types of layouts, such as large rooms with hundreds of bunk beds, or just dozens upon dozens of lined up twins. Some were maze-like facilities with dozens of small rooms. Some had relatively larger rooms that packed in dozens of people. Many had small ones that packed just the same. Most people washed their clothes outside and cut each other's hair. The quality of the restrooms to the showers were of course terrible. People worked 10 to 12 hour long shifts with no limit on working hours. Braceros were at times allowed to leave the camps, and Americans made an agreement with the Mexicans about discrimination laws allowing some leeway. Many who were not let into the program just crossed over anyway. After making the long trek, they were captured by law enforcement. Others would end up working jobs similar to what they would have ended up working in the Bracero program. Nearly 70% of those immigrating from the South were attempting to enter for the program, but were denied for various reasons. The demand for labor was still there though, so farmers hired the people who crossed anyway. For years this was overlooked because of said demand. However, the populace began to have disdain for the growing number of Mexicans, who of course were hated because of not being American enough. Alongside the obvious reactionary element, there was another, even larger reactionary element going across America, the Second Red Scare, also known as McCarthyism, that ramped up as the Cold War began.
If a person supports organizations which reflect communist teachings, or organizations labeled communist by the Department of Justice, she may be a communist.
Lawmakers were cautious about communist infiltration going into 1950, especially with the North's offensive into the South and the escalation of the Korean War. This ramped up the wave of general distrust in foreigners, alongside the remnants of the Brown Scare from the 1930s. Even throughout all of that, the program continued on throughout the war, albeit with a little bit more border security. This didn't stop much though, as demand for the labor remained constant. By 1954, the Red Scare had started to reach its peak, and distrust had grown to an all-time high. With this new climate, immigration services in just a swing, an Eisenhower-appointed general, will contact the Mexican government and begin a deportation program unseen in American history. The operation would be led by immigration services allying with local police. They would conduct raids arresting anyone suspected without proof of legal residency. Due process was not widely used, so anyone regardless of citizenship was deported for simply not having proof. Thousands of people found themselves in this fate, including this mother. The police would appear at local farms in unmarked vehicles, asking all workers for proof of legal residency. As for those who did not have any proof, they were thrown in the back of unmarked vans and driven to be lined up in the thousands, then processed by police. Many were held in jail-like facilities for weeks or months. Immigration services alongside the police requested thousands of buses to be gathered across the nation. After being thrown into buses, they were then driven to the Gulf of Mexico, where they were then loaded onto vessels destined for mostly van crews, far out from where people mostly came from, which was closer to the border. This was to prevent re-entry. The operation deported more than 1 million people. Of those, 200,000 of them were American citizens. Even after the operation, which really only lasted for 1954, with numbers declining into 1955 and sharply afterward, the Bracero program continued. This contradiction between the large part of the public's disdain for immigrants, but capital owners continuously pushing for them, would be a key part of American politics continuing forward. The Bracero program was especially useful besides free labor because of the anti-union aspect of it. Braceros flat out could not unionize. The Mexican government would not allow it.
Los consulados los mismos iban a los campos de los braceros y le decían, muchachos, ustedes representan a México, trabajen, no hagan caso de huelgas, ni de sindicatos ni nada. Si nos damos cuenta, nosotros mismos nos encargamos de castigarlos.
After many protests that erupted into the capital, and a lot more heated politics going into the 1960s, it ended in 1964, which coincides with the explosion of popularity of the Farm Workers Union and Cesar Chavez, who made a remark about this very subject.
This is the case right now in one of the strikes we have with the Butte Gas and Oil Company, where we've closed them down, then have been unable to get strike breakers, or we've gotten very few, and then all of a sudden yesterday morning, They brought in 220 wetbacks. These are the illegals from Mexico. Now, there's no way to defend against that kind of strike break.
There is an obvious parallel to what you can see going on today. You would not be first to see it.
On my first day back in the Oval Office, I will sign a historic slate of executive orders to close our border to illegal aliens and stop the invasion of our country. And on that same day, we will begin the largest deportation operation in American history, larger even than that of President Dwight D. Eisenhower.
His approval for the plan marks a precedent for what he's going to do going forward, using prison-like conditions like we did in 1954, like he's going to do in Guantanamo Bay. Due process being largely ignored, now via the Lincoln-Riley Act. However, Trump's plan would see the deportation of 12 million people, 12 times that of Eisenhower's plan. What will come of Trump's plan? Who knows? The last time this was attempted, Americans saw no real material gain from it. And if that's anything to go by, be my guess.
Wade into the river, through the rippling shadow waters, still across the thirsty border, Bracero. Come bring your hungry body to the golden fields of plenty, from a peso to a penny, Bracero. Welcome to California, where the friendly...
You've been charged with sex crimes with children?
Not really.
Not really? And never been deported?
Nope.
Huh. Let's take him in, process him, lock him up.